So we're in the book of Esther. We're studying at this point, chapter 5. By way of review, we've taken a look at this outline. And of course, the whole book talks about God's providence among his people during good times and bad. We talked about the theme being that God accomplishes his purposes. And we're going to spend some time in application talking about ordinary people and extraordinary circumstances. And of course, Christ in Esther, just like Esther was an advocate for her people, Jesus is my advocate. The Bible says there's one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. We talked about the world history that's going on inside of Esther. We talked about the comparisons and contrasts between the book of Esther and the book of Daniel. We mentioned the acrostics that are in the book of Esther, and we've got several that we're going to be covering yet today. And we ended up here talking about the key verses for such a time as this. The declaration went out that the Jews were going to be annihilated. Mordecai is messaging back and forth with Esther. Esther has a little bit of trepidation, maybe a lot of trepidation about going before the king. And Mordecai says, look, don't think that because you live in the palace, because you're the queen, that you're going to escape this thing. You're going to die. And somebody else is going to save the Jews. And don't you know, you could be born for such a time as this. And Esther's response was, okay, I'm going to suck it up. I'm going to do it. And if I perish, I perish. So a little bit of application. What makes women different from men? Why was Esther the right person for the job? Well, in today's day and age, we can't even define what a woman is. But what makes a woman different from a man? And I'm thinking that if somebody went through surgery, these kinds of aspects would still be different. First of all, the woman's intuition, the ability to see through situations, sense the unspoken, perceive the feelings under the surface. It's sort of like a sixth or maybe seventh, eighth, and ninth sense that women have that men don't. I've coined a phrase. I don't think my wife appreciates it, but she understands what I'm saying. She'll say something, but she's really trying to say something different. And my comment is, I don't take hints and I can't solve riddles because I have zero intuition.
I'll join the party.
You can use my phrase.
Yeah, I'm sure she agrees.
Be careful of a backhand.
I'm oblivious at times.
Women have endurance, and before we started, we even talked about tolerance for pain. They have the ability to handle pain. They have the ability to stay on a task. They've got an ability to persevere. They have a certain degree of responsiveness. They're willing to express their feelings, as opposed to, in our culture, we've been told men don't cry, big boys don't cry, stand on your own 2 feet. A woman has a more ability to show warmth and affection. Imagine if it was Mordecai that said, if I perish, I perish. I'm going to go in front of the king. There's man to man. And would the king extend his scepter to a guy versus extending his scepter to Esther? And I'm back again to thinking he loved Esther not as a sex object, but as a companion, as a helpmate. A woman has a degree of vulnerability. She has the ability to confess her weakness, admit her fears, ask for help. Men don't even ask for directions. I'm so thankful I've got GPS on my phone, because otherwise I'd still be out there wandering. What does Solomon say about an Esther? What does Solomon say about a woman? A kind-hearted woman gains respect. And we've learned about Esther, how she gained the favor of everybody that she ran into. We don't know anything about her before she was selected as part of the beauty pageant. But I can only imagine that in her community, and we don't know if the Jews lived in their own I don't want to use the word ghetto because that suggests poverty sort of thing, but their own neighborhood. Yeah. Even today, you go to South Philly and you have the Italian neighborhood as an example. And so what kind of a woman was Esther before the fact? I'm expecting she's the same kind of a woman after the fact. There are some people that they have got such charisma that when they walk in the door, people know that they've arrived. Very different from the person who walks in the door and thinks he's the smartest person in the room. Esther was a kind-hearted woman, and she gained respect. A wife of noble character is her husband's crown, but a disgraceful wife is like decay in his bones. Now, Vashti was not a disgraceful wife. I think Vashti she of course had physical beauty, but I think she also was a good buddy to Ahasuerus. But he got drunk and she got deposed, and in comes Esther. He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord. And that king definitely received favor from the Lord. He was used by Haman, but then he was utilized by God to defeat that big act of anti-Semitism. Houses and wealth are inherited from parents, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. So, advice for today's Esthers, both male and female, a male Esther and a female Esther. Cultivation of character is our focal point. Esther, when Mordecai said, you have to do this thing, it wasn't, this is the first time in her life she had to think about a challenge. That character has been cultivated from the very, very early on. She was taught to listen to Mordecai from very, very early on. So the cultivation of character, and we have a cultivation of character going on right now in Vacation Bible School. Ask God to cultivate within you a discontent with the superficial and a desire for the spiritual. We're going to find when we get into the lesson today that nothing pleased Haman as long as Mordecai was around. Then we're going to see Mordecai in his change of clothes, and we're going to add that to these particular points. So first of all, the decree went out, and Mordecai put on sackcloth and ashes. And as we get into the story, he's going to be able to wear the king's robes for the day, sit on the king's horse, and have Haman lead him through the town. And Mordecai is still thinking, my people are going to die. He had no concern. No, it did not go to his head that he got to wear the king's clothes. And when they were done marching him through the city, he put the sackcloth and ashes back on, and he went back to the gate. He had a desire for the spiritual, a desire for his people. Trust God to control the circumstances around you. You know, in the world today uses the phrase, don't worry, be happy. Well, if that were put into a spiritual context, that's a pretty good thing to have. Don't worry, be happy. 1 Peter 3, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. Esther had an opportunity, and as we study this lesson, she was many years as the queen. And over time, I expect Esther's character wore off onto the king. The Bible says she found favor in his sight. So in that verse, a woman could be married to a man, and the woman could be saved, but the man not. It's not a question of nagging the guy, begging the guy to come to church. Sometimes those things have the opposite effect. But to win the man by the conduct, by the lifestyle, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. And even though Esther wasn't seen by the king for that 30-day window prior to the day she opens the door and walks in, he saw her respect and her purity. Do not let your adorning be external. This goes back again to the day Esther was introduced to the king for the very first time. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So, how do you define a gentle and a quiet spirit? Gentle and a quiet spirit. I'm pretty rough around the edges. I'm pretty direct. A lot of times I have to go to my wife and say, how would you say this? And yet, sometimes I think I have a gentle and a quiet spirit. I also deal with impatience. I deal with anger. But a goal would be to strive towards a gentle and a quiet spirit. How do you define attractiveness? What makes, I'll just speak as a guy, what makes a woman beautiful? What makes her attractive? I would say my definition when I was a young guy is very different than my definition as an old guy. I would say, and I've seen this when I walk into a grocery store, I'll see a lady pushing the shopping cart and I'll say, I'll bet she's a Christian. And it's not because she wears, and I'm just going to pick on our local dress codes. It's not because she's wearing a denim skirt down to her ankles and a covering on her head. It's a countenance thing. And so we define attractiveness as a countenance, a beauty that's from the inside being exhibited on the outside. Lessons learned. So Mordecai, the lesson we learn from Mordecai is to always remember that someone will resent your independent devotion to the Lord. Never underestimate the diabolical nature of revenge. Now, we're going to learn as we get deeper into this study, there's a difference between revenge and retribution. When the second decree went out that said to the Jews, if you get attacked, you're authorized to fight back. That's a retribution. Lesson from Xerxes: never ever overestimate your own importance. There's the king. He's in charge of everything. He was influenced by his council when they threw Vashti out. He was influenced by the young men to pick a new queen. He was influenced by Haman to do that edict. And finally, at the very end, I suppose he did the right thing. He allowed himself to be influenced by Mordecai and Esther when Mordecai became the prime minister. Never overestimate your own importance. Waiting on the Lord. I heard it said that when Dwight Eisenhower launched the D-Day invasion, when he was done, he sat back in his chair in the war room and he said, all we have to do now is wait. They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. I once heard a pastor preach a message. Do you want to mount up like an eagle, or do you want to run with a flock of turkeys? And he took that message to go and compare all the different physical attributes between an eagle that soars and a turkey that just rummages. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. Mordecai was in sackcloth and ashes for a long time. I don't know about you, but even if I get a haircut and those little hairs are sitting on my neck, or if I'm working in the ground and an ant happens to walk on me, I go crazy until I get to take a shower. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So what is waiting on God like? First of all, we gain new strength. We just learned that from Isaiah. We get a better perspective. We use the phrase fly off the handle. That comes all the way back to Elisha in the scriptures, flying off the handle. We get a better perspective on things if we wait. Harry Truman said that if he wrote out a letter, this is pre-email. Sometimes you write email so fast you hit the send button, you go, oh no. he would write out a letter, and if it was a hateful letter, he would put it in his desk drawer and wait until the next day. Well, when the end of his term came, he opened up his desk drawer and he said, what am I going to do with all this mail that I never sent? Because he got a new perspective waiting for that next day. We store up extra energy. We deepen our determination to persevere. We're going to come back to Isaiah shortly. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Behold, all who are incensed against you shall be put to shame. There's Haman right there. All who are incensed against you shall be put to shame. Now, keep in mind, Isaiah wrote this more than 500 years before Mordecai makes the scene. And like every observant Jew, they are exposed to a lot of scripture. As Mordecai is waiting on the Lord, does he have Isaiah in his brain? We don't know. Behold, all who are incensed against you shall be put to shame and confounded. Those who strive against you shall be as nothing and shall perish. You shall seek those who contend with you, but you shall not find them. Those who war against you shall be as nothing at all. For I, the Lord, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not, for I am the one who helps you. So Esther, we talked about Mordecai and waiting on the Lord. Esther had to go through a transition. She went from fear to faith. In just those last few verses in chapter 4, she said, Mordecai, if I go in, he could kill me, to if I perish, I perish. She went from reluctance to resolve. We're studying the book of Daniel, and we talk about the reasons for studying eschatology. And we have to live for him, to work for him, to be eager to do it, from Titus. Her concern for herself and her safety went to the concern for her people. And her respect for Mordecai's leadership evolved to emerging to her becoming a leader herself. So, what difference can I make? And here are some bullets from One Vote. They come from John Salisbury's book, One Vote, A Message for Americas. One vote determined whether people should speak English or German. One vote brought Texas into the Union. One vote saved Andrew Jackson from impeachment. One vote made Rutherford Hayes the U.S. president. One vote gave Adolf Hitler control of the Nazi Party. One vote, one person, and that person was Esther. So a quick review before we go back into the book. Esther becomes the queen. Mordecai uncovers an assassination plot, and it gets reported through Esther. Haman is offended by Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow, even though the king commanded it. So Haman puts together this plan that he's going to kill all the Jews. He gets the king to sign it, and so the king and Haman are having themselves some drinks in the palace, while the people in the city, they're confused, they're confounded, and they're mourning because their friends are going to die. We get into chapter 5, and Esther goes before the king for such a time as this, and she's cast her reluctance to the wind, and she says, if I perish, I perish. Then in chapter 5, we see Esther's first banquet. Haman is so proud to be invited, but he's pouting because he's got nothing if Mordecai is still alive. He comes home, and Zeresh, his wife, says, why don't you just hang him and go to the next banquet? So here we are, Esther chapter 5. On the third day, this is after 3 days of fasting, she, her ladies, Mordecai, and everybody he got the word out to. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne, opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. She won favor. We've seen that so many, many different times. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. That was the life sentence. If he didn't hold out the scepter, it would be the death sentence. And those attendees, their job would be to put Queen Esther to death. He held out the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. I'm thinking about Ephesians chapter 5. So that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And there you see Esther approaching the king. Now, the king was, one of his titles was the Lion King. And of course, Jesus is the Lion of Judah. And there'll come a time, it's called the judgment seat of Christ. It happens right after the rapture when we get presented to the king. Now, there's a part of judgment that's good news, and there's a part of judgment that's bad news. It's not a judgment of heaven versus hell, but it's a judgment of rewards or no rewards. And as I approach that king, my judgment is this. It's not my sins are going to be thrown up on a screen like a drive-in movie, because nobody's going to be watching that movie. They're watching their own movie. As I approach that king, running in my mind, here's the judgment. Running in my mind is every idle thought, every word, every deed. They're all being brought into an account. Because from his perspective, he sees me without spot and without blemish. It's going to be a judgment. It's going to be a painful one, but he's not two-sided. He's not saying, well, I'm going to make you squirm, and then we're going to talk about your rewards. And just like Esther, the king reaches out his scepter, his golden scepter, and he receives me without spot, without blemish. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom. Now, even to the half of my kingdom is just a phrase that they used. In fact, Herod used it when Herodias was going to dance for him. I'll give you anything, even up to the, if she said, yeah, I'll take half the kingdom, he'll probably say, just kill her off, or we're going to do something different here. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. There's another acrostic. Let the king come. Jehovah, let the king come. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? And once again, even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Now, here's where the intuition comes in. We don't know what Esther saw in the king. We don't know what Esther saw in Haman. Maybe she felt the timing wasn't right. Maybe she felt that her husband still had the affairs of the kingdom on his brain because they went quickly to the meal. But instead of on that particular session, she says, oh, Xerxes, I've got this problem. We're going to die. That's not what she says. He says, what is your wish? It'll be granted to you. I'm ready to give it. And maybe, like I said, he's got his mind maybe not completely on the situation. And then Esther answered, my wish and my request is, everybody's waiting. My wish and my request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my wish, there she goes again. She says it up above, and she says it again. Let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king had said. Keep in mind, God is behind all this stuff. every movement that's going on, God is behind it, as he is today. So the question becomes, are you an Esther? It comes from Ezekiel. And I sought for a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl among them who should build up the wall and stand in the breach before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found none. In this case, he found Esther. Later on, we're going to ask the question, which walls fell because of Esther? And we're going to lean on the scene in Joshua where the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. It said, I sought for a man among them who should build up the wall and stand in the breach. Well, Nehemiah helped build up the wall, and he stood in the breach until the wall was complete. But this is Esther. This is, I hate to say it this way, just a woman. Well, she was more than a woman. She was a leader. She was a queen. She was an advocate. She was a picture of Jesus as she stood there in the breach. So Haman plans to hang Mordecai. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. He's in there and he has dinner with just the king and the queen. Keep in mind, he was probably one of those nobles that was part of the 180-day feast plus the 7. He was in there. He was the prime minister. He was in the courtroom. There were generals and other nobles are there. And he by himself, against all those other feasts. Keep in mind, there was a feast that the king made when he selected queen, and he was probably there. He gets to go with just the king and the queen, and he gets invited to go back. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, what did Mordecai look like in the king's gate? Sackcloth and ashes. Did Mordecai bow? No. Was Mordecai even looking around, or was he there with his head bowed? We don't know. But we do know this. When Haman saw Mordecai, the blood pressure went up. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Think about that. He got his death wish for the Jews. They did the edict that went out by Pony Express to all the people. He got to keep his 10,000 talents of silver. He offered $163 million to have that edict, and it was given back to him. He got to dine with the king and the queen. He was wealthy. He had real estate. He had 10 sons, but as far as he was concerned, he had nothing when he saw Mordecai. He would be dining with them even again. Nevertheless, Haman, keep in mind, magnificent, Mr. Magnificent, restrained himself and went home. And he sent and he brought his friends and his wife Zeresh, which means misery. And she's going to be delivering a miserable message to Haman. Why did he invite his friends and everybody to his house? We're going to see, so he can show off. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. There's acrostic number 2. It is worth nothing. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanity, all is vanity. Worthless, worthless, everything is worthless. Solomon had gold. Solomon had wisdom. Solomon had all this stuff. And in that book, he just went through all the things that tried to give him pleasure. And he finally said, this is the conclusion of the matter: fear God. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. She says, I've got this great idea. Let's go build this swing set out in the back, and we're going to let Mordecai swing on the swing set. Now, one of the tragedies of the modern translations is this. Modern translations do not say 50 cubits. They say 75 feet. And the symbolism is gone because the number 5 in the Bible stands for either grace or death. Now, if they built the gallows 5 cubits high, that'd be 7.5 feet. And that's enough to hang somebody. It's enough to impale somebody if you want to go that route, but it wouldn't be extraordinary. So instead of 5 cubits, it was 50 cubits. And it was grace for Mordecai, and it was death for Haman. Just like when David picked the pebbles out of the creek for Goliath, he picked out 5 stones for Goliath and his brothers. It was grace for David, and it was death for Goliath. So Haman plans to hang Mordecai. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Notice, ask the king, tell the king. Now this man is full of himself, and the people are feeding his pride, his magnificence. Then, after he's hanged, then just go joyfully with the king to the feast. The idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Keep in mind, that happened overnight in his front yard. So he's going to go to sleep, and he's going to sleep just fine, because when his head hits the pillow, he's saying, okay, we've got a plan for Mordecai. And he leans over to his wife and he says, you are such a sweetheart. You've given me such a wonderful idea. And off to sleep he goes. But then we get into chapter 6. On that night, the king could not sleep. Haman had a good rest, but the king not so much. And the king gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. A verse from Psalm 127. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Now, the king is squarely in God's hand, but God did not give the king sleep because he had this particular situation in mind. We don't know if at that banquet they had too much to drink, which would have put him in real good position to go to sleep. We don't know if she fed him pepperoni and he couldn't sleep because of that. We don't know what caused it other than it was God's hand. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And so there's Mordecai, and there's Haman, and there's Mordecai, but that's not what Mordecai looked like on that particular day. He looked more like that. This is that following morning. Haman wakes up. He's got the plan from Zeresh. He said, I can still hear the hammers going on and the chainsaws, and they're putting on the final touches for that gallows. I'm going to walk into the king and I'm going to say, King, we need to kill Mordecai. And I'm going to tell the king that we're going to kill Mordecai. So he's walking towards the court, and what does he see? The other people are all bowing down, just like King said. And there's Mordecai, the object of all of his grief, sitting there in sackcloth and ashes. And he's thinking, all this is worth nothing to me. I have these guys bowing down to me. I don't need that. As long as that guy won't bow down, all this other stuff is meaningless. So the king said, who was in the court? Of all the people that could be out in the court, the nobles, the generals, the guards, here's Haman stomping down the marble floors, coming to the courtroom to tell King that he's going to kill Mordecai. Who's in the court? Now, Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace. He had just entered. Only God could pull this off like this. He just entered into the outer courts to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows. He was going to tell the king. But think what happens. What happens is break time.
Just set it here and you can help yourself.
Thank you. We're breaking so it doesn't matter. That's all good.
Thank you.
Okay. James, if you could pass those around, that would be a good thing. Is anyone besides me interested in some water?
I will take some water, please.
Okay.
I like watching.
Oh, it's a bestseller.
Just one thing, when you edit,
Yes.
you had said when Herodias was going to dance, it was her daughter
It was her
Salome.
daughter.
Yeah, just a few.
Anybody else want some H2O? People coming up. Yelling anybody? There you go.
I'll try these. Good watermelon fan. I mean, if you can get a good watermelon, my problem is I can never pick a good watermelon.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, they just, if it's flat or mealy, it's, to get a sweet watermelon is great.
My wife has a knack because she never gets a bad watermelon. I only have one regret. She always picks the seedless ones.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to teach my kids how to spit watermelon seeds and never had a chance. Do you have a veggie garden?
Good one. 3 regular tomatoes, 2 cherries, 4 or 5 cucumber plants, and a couple squash. I just have a little patch behind. I mean, I used to have a big garden,
Mhm.
but just the 2 of us, it's not worth it. And the last time my daughter-in-law and I helped me put one in. I mean, this is what, 7, 8 years ago or so now. And basically, the deer cropped the top of the corn, top of the green beans, and I just, I mean, I like seeing the deer, but I also don't, like going to all that effort to feed them.
So I finally found a way to deter deer and rabbits.
Well,
I made my own concoction of rotten eggs, rotten milk, garlic, cayenne pepper, let it sit in the sun for a week or so, strain it and put it in the garden sprayer and spray.
You spray it on all the plants?
Well, I mulch the plant so I can spray it on the mulch,
Okay.
and then the smell just permeates. Well, after I finally figured this thing out, I'm over in Lowe's and I saw this thing that says deer and rabbit repellent, and I'm reading the ingredients. There was my ingredients. So I take care of that. But I'm learning this year the impact of the wrong companion plants.
Oh, yeah.
And I have yet to study on this because I figured it out yesterday and I have to validate it with good old Google. I put some tomato plants in the ground And I wanted tomatoes early this year, so I went and I spent the extra money for the tomato plants that already had tomatoes and already had blossoms, and they did nothing.
Oh, yeah.
And then I got to thinking, they are planted where I planted potatoes last year. So then I look up companion plants to tomatoes and I found out you're not supposed to plant tomatoes near potatoes.
Huh.
So I'm wondering if there's something still in the earth.
Yeah.
So then this year I put in this dome of, I call it pig wire. Basically a dome of wire like this. And I planted peas on both sides. So they would grow up and pick the peas. The peas on this side, I'm getting a bumper crop. And the peas on this side, they're all scrawny and yellow and it's the same dirt. Right next to that dome are potatoes planted. So I've got to look up what the companion plants to peas are.
Or is it something the potatoes are depleting the soil of?
Could be.
You know, I mean, the potatoes being in the ground and, I mean, I'm sure certain plants use certain nutrients and or nitrogen or fixed nitrogen,
Mhm.
you know.
Well, the peas put nitrogen back into the ground, but it's the root of the potato that really is doing the growing. I mean, they've got plants coming up the
Right,
top, but
right.
it's the root. So it could be the phosphorus, could be the potassium. I don't know, but that's going to be my big study when I have this stuff under control.
Uh-huh.
But we do have a bumper crop this year of broccoli.
Okay. Broccoli makes great soup. Yeah, the cheesy broccoli soup that's, you know.
I had this great idea, and I hope my wife will do it for me. I said, the stalk of that broccoli plant tastes just like broccoli, even though everybody wants to eat just the little
Yeah.
florets.
No.
So why don't we take that broccoli stalk, cut it in about 4-inch things, and then cut it once this way, and then grill them. Have grilled peppers and grilled broccoli stalks, see what happens. I said, and so if you're going to make soup and you let it cook very slowly, why don't you take that stalk and just cut it this way and make soup out of it? Is that, would you use that for your soup?
I'm gonna use the whole tops, but I mean, you know, about this much as the stalk.
But not the whole stem.
No.
We're going to try it. And I've also discovered that the leaves are edible. So what I do when I'm out there with my garden, I'll just pick off broccoli leaves and I'll be eating broccoli leaves while I'm hoeing or we're doing whatever I
Okay.
have to do. So there's a produce auction in Oxford. And I'll tell you, a lot of guys complain that their wives spend foolishly. Not my wife. She can get blood out of a buffalo nickel. Rather than going to little Amish greenhouse to buy a few plants, she'll go to the produce auction and she'll spend hours listening to these wholesalers bid on this stuff, waiting for them to not bid on something that is well below market price. That's when she'll buy something. So she ended up buying me 2 flats of broccoli plants. And I put 1 flat into our place, must be 100 plants. And I gave those guys the other flat. So the broccoli is just now starting to come. So after Bible study, what are your plans for the day?
I think I'm gonna get an itchy neck you were complaining of. And I need a haircut.
Okay.
Beyond that, I'm not sure yet. I did get the grass cut yesterday, so that's done. Fortunately, especially after last night's rain
Ooh.
and hail. And so,
I can't remember having any hail, but
I heard stuff. I mean, I don't think they were big, but it wasn't just rain, it was hitting the glass and stuff and the roof. So,
we had 1 lightning bolt. The lightning and the sound were simultaneous. It had been somewhere right on my property.
so I hate that. I've done that years ago in the other house we lived in, which is just 2.5 miles away, but I don't know what, it was during the summer. And a storm started up and I went to go close the windows in the boys' room and just as I was reaching up to pull down, this flash bang. It just, I mean, instant flash bang. I mean, you would talk about a beating heart. But oh, yeah, well, yeah, that happened.
I used to know how to compute the distance by counting the seconds between the lightning and the thunder. Is it 2 seconds is a mile?
I'm not, I don't know what, I've never, I know there's a sound and the speed of sound versus the speed of light are completely different, so.
Mhm. Well, I would look it up, but I don't want to mess the recording and end up having to do another re-record.
No. I mean, light's moving at 186,000 miles per second and sound is, speed of sound is what, yeah, I mean, it's much slower.
It's a whole lot slower.
Yeah. Do okay in math, but I never enjoyed physics because of all the math they made you do, and I mean, math is a useful tool. I just did not, it's not my best subject.
Mhm. It's sort of like shooting a deer with a high-powered rifle. It's hit before it hears the bullet.
Yeah.
You don't hear the bullet, hear the gun. Okay. And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come inside, let him come in." So Haman came in. And before Haman had a chance to talk to the king about Mordecai, the king started the conversation. And the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now, keep in mind, Haman is full of himself, Haman the Magnificent. And so Haman is thinking to himself, well, who else would he want to honor other than me? And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials." He's not thinking about handing them to him. He's thinking about handing them to number 2. "And let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor. And let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse that you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." So there's Haman. "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Now, if Mordecai had a sense of humor, and if Haman wasn't shouting, with all the exuberance that he was supposed to, I could see Mordecai leaning down from that horse and say, "Haman, what did you say?" "I said, let it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." And he got to parade Mordecai in front of all those other people that were bowing down to Haman. He may have had to go by his own house and by his own gallows as he was marching through the city with this guy. So shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. Keep in mind, Mordecai started in sackcloth and ashes. He's riding on the king's horse in the king's robe. And he's thinking, all this is worth nothing to me. We just had Haman with that quote, all this is worth nothing to me, when he's thinking of the riches that he had. And now here's Mordecai's thinking, all this is worth nothing to me, this day of parade, because my people are going to die. And then he returns to the king's gate. He's back to his watch position. He's back to his waiting on the Lord position. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. The king, right now, the king's sitting in his throne room, and he's thinking, life is good. I've married the most wonderful woman. She put together the most wonderful meal for me. I didn't have a good night's rest last night, but that Haman, what a great guy. He came in and he gave me the best advice on what to do for a guy that I'd like to honor. And I can imagine he's out there right now just ripping up the city saying, this is what should be done to the man that the king wants to honor. What's going through the queen's mind right now? She fed Haman and she fed the king the night before. She's certainly very nervous because she's going to be making this request. On top of that, she's preparing, or her maids or whoever, they're preparing this meal, they're preparing this feast. So just like a woman, she's able to multi-process. She's got the food going on. She's got the speech that she's about to make. She's got, even though the book doesn't mention, she's got a whole lot of prayer going on. And she's oblivious to what's happening right now outside the court with Mordecai and Haman. The people are in confusion. Keep in mind, the Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem roughly 50 years prior. Most of them chose to hang around. They're in the neighborhood. They're fruitful. They're contributing. They're good people. And then the edict comes out that they're going to kill them, and the city went into confusion. I'm sure they figured out it was all Haman's doing, and Haman is the prime minister. And now Haman's leading the horse and Mordecai through the city. They're confused. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. That's interesting because we're going to read later on that the servants are going to cover his head as part of the death sentence. And he's already covering his head. He's in mourning because he went to the king with the intention of telling the king to murder Mordecai. And he's coming back saying, I had to honor Mordecai. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. He was knocked off his horse, if you will. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Now that word if is an interesting word. Sometimes it's translated as if, meaning conditional, and sometimes it's translated like since or because. And I'm looking at that word right now saying, because Mordecai is of the Jewish people, you're in deep trouble. While they were yet speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So here's Haman. He comes home. He's in deep mourning. His head is covered. He's in no way, shape, or form ready mentally to go be with the king and the queen and have a good old time. And what happens? He gets swept up by the eunuchs and taken off to the feast. Now, a little play on words there. He was taken off to the feast that Esther had prepared, taken off to the feast that God had prepared. God's not mentioned in this book, but he's behind every single move. Which brings us to chapter 7. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Third time he says this to Esther. And Esther's response, once again, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king." And I have there Nehemiah 2. In the book of Nehemiah in chapter 2, Nehemiah the cupbearer is approaching the king, and Nehemiah has the building of Jerusalem on his brain. And the king says to him, "Nehemiah, you're looking pretty sad." And he's supposed to be the guy that's making sure there's no poison in the food. The king's concerned. And we read in Nehemiah, Nehemiah prayed and answered the king. Now, one of the things in the book of Esther is prayer is not mentioned, but here's the queen. I expect just like Nehemiah a generation later, Queen Esther prayed and answered the king. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king," she didn't even say she didn't call him honey. He is the husband, "O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request." She's had those 3 days of fasting. She's had the day of asking the king for the meal. Whether that happened that night or the next night, we don't know, but let's give it 2 days. She has the meal prep of this day. She had 4 or 5 days to think about what is she going to say to the king. And so these are the words recorded in posterity, recorded before posterity, ever since the world began. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. "If it please the king, let my life be granted me." Just like my request for salvation. If it please the king, let my life be granted me. "And my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." What's the king losing? He would be losing faithful subjects. He would be losing tax revenue. So basically she's saying, "Hubby, you turned down 10,000 talents of gold, and now you're going to forfeit all those tax dollars from the Jews. What's wrong with you?" Of course, she said it in a more respectful way. So there's Esther, there's the king, and there's Naaman, and there's Haman, and there are the servants. And then the king said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Now, this is one of the real high points of this story. Who is he, and where is he? And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. But here is what is also woven into these verses. The acrostic Yahweh. Who is he? The answer is Yahweh. I am. And where is he? Psalm 139. He's everywhere. And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Now, what's interesting is this. In our society, we use a Roman alphabet and Arabic numbers. In the Greek world, they would use the Greek alphabet, but they would also use Greek quote unquote numbers. Alpha is 1, beta is 2, etc. I'd hate to do arithmetic in that world. But in the Hebrew world, the same was true. They had a Hebrew alphabet, and they used Hebrew letters for arithmetic. Their equivalent of A is number 1 and B is number 2. And if you take that phrase, this wicked Haman, in the Hebrew, it comes out to 666. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. Now, I don't know how much wine he drank. And he was a pretty good wine drinker because he spent those 187 days, and then he was drinking with the celebration he had for Esther as queen, and he's drinking with Haman when they decided to do the edict, and he's drinking in the first meal, and he's drinking in the second meal. But I think he sobered up really quickly when he rose in his wrath from the wine drinking, and he went into the palace based on this wicked Haman. Haman wants to not just kill your wife, but all those people. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. He, just like Belshazzar, the handwriting was on the wall. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. Now, look at what happens next. And only God could do this. God was hiding underneath the tablecloth, and he trips Haman. The king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine. And as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was, and the king said, will he even assault the queen? He's thinking, Haman doesn't just want to kill her, he wants to rape her before he does. And he says, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. So there you see Haman down at the couch. They didn't eat on chairs like we have here. They would recline on couches. And there are the servants getting ready to haul him out of there. Then Harbona, what a name, Harbona. I can imagine Harbona sort of like Mr. Clean, this great big muscle guy, no hair, big earring. Is it Harbona? He's, boss, I've got this great idea. There's these gallows over in his front yard. Let's use those. Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the wrath of the king was abated. They probably did it just that night. I mean, they weren't going to put him in the jail and let him think about it. There was no due process. He was the king, and the king said, you wicked Haman, you're going to die. They hauled him right out. The Bible doesn't tell us whether the king stayed and hung around with Esther. I can only imagine that he did. I can only imagine that there was a great degree of comfort that was there. But I could also imagine that there was some trepidation there because the law does not get revoked. There's some ups and downs in Esther. So here we have Xerxes, Ahasuerus. He's up at that first party. He's down at his defeat of the Salamis. He's up when he selected Esther. He's down when he could not sleep. He's up and down. Then we have the ups and downs of Esther. She's down as an orphan. Up when she was selected to be the queen. Down when she was told that she has to approach the king. Up when she's accepted in the court by Xerxes. I think she was in suspended animation when she's getting ready to give her speech. And then ultimately on the upside, when the king says, Haman, you're going to die. Then there's Mordecai. He's on the downslope when he learned of Haman's edict to kill the Jews. He's on the upside when he's honored by the king, yet he says this stuff is meaningless. He's down when he's fasting for Esther, and he's up when Haman's plot fails. And then we have Haman. He's up when he becomes the prime minister. He's down when Mordecai would not bow to him. He's up again with his plot to destroy the Jews. He's down when he has to march Mordecai through the capital city. He's up when he's invited to dine with the king and queen, not just once, but twice. And he's down in the end.
Actually, he was up.
He was up. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to quit the study right here.
Okay.
We have an opportunity. Let me just turn this thing off.